In the previous mini lecture, I talked about the arrival at the Constitutional Convention, the predicament which was to avoid both tyranny and anarchy, and there was a debate about which was the greater evil. Obviously, the nationalists were more fearful of anarchy, the anti nationalists were more fearful of tyranny, but everyone wanted to avoid both. The delegates not only agreed that they wanted to avoid both of these twin evils, but they also agreed that the new country should be a republic, that there should be checks and balances, separation of powers, power fragmentation, and that ultimately the national government had to be supreme in at least some areas, although they disagreed to what extent. In today's mini lecture, and probably this mini lecture and probably the next one, I want to talk about the first, and from their perspective, meaning the framers' perspective, the most significant area of conflict for them, which was representation. Because this is about power. This is about who is going to control this new government. The small states were absolutely terrified of a strong national government that might control them. The large states wanted a government that they could control. And so there you see once again that debate over how powerful the national government should be. There really is not a right or a wrong answer here, but I do want you to realize that both parties advocated representation that would enhance their self interest. And, when you talk about that, sometimes people make the assumption that self interest is evil, it's bad. It's not necessarily bad, it just means that you're self interested. So, as you might guess, the large states wanted to base representation on population. They wanted to base representation on people. And if the government had only been based on population, then the three largest states would have had more political power than the other 10 states combined. And today, in 2020, if, say, our Congress were based only on population, then the largest 9 states in the country would have more political power than the other 41 combined because a majority of Americans, more than 50% of every American today, lives in the 9 most populated states. So if you base representation only on population, then the government is going to be controlled by a relatively small number of states. And as you might guess, the small states objected to this. The small states advocated representation on geography. They believed that all states should be represented equally. That was what had happened under the Articles of Confederation. And these delegates said, look, we know what the problems are. We saw them. We're willing to work and create a stronger national government in the area of taxation and military and umpire, judges, etc. So don't mess with representation. It is we, the states, that are creating this new government, and therefore we should all be represented equally. And as you can see, I have written the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And I don't want you to know the specifics about them. Greenberg and Page go into it. When I was taking this class, God, this is going to be hard to admit to you guys, but you guys have already figured out I'm an old guy. And by the way, I'm making this on my 62nd birthday. So once again, happy birthday to me. I took this course in the 1970s, and my professor made us memorize the key elements of both the Virginia and New Jersey plan. I raised my hand. I said, Professor, these are plans. They never affected anyone. Why do we have to remember them? And he gave me a smile and he said, "Well, Mr. Randall, someday if you teach this class, you can teach it the way you want. But since this is my class, you need to memorize this." And of course, in a great irony, I went back to my old community college and became a part-time teacher, and my old political science teacher became a colleague of mine. So the Virginia plan, this was the large state plan that advocated representation on population. Just to summarize it real quick, the Virginia plan had a bicameral or two-house legislature. Both houses would be based on population, which meant the three largest states would control both houses of Congress. In their proposal, the Congress would then choose the president, which means the three largest states would then choose the president. And then Supreme Court justices would be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Congress, which meant the three largest states would also control the Supreme Court. They also had a very extensive supremacy clause, which said that the Congress could override any state law whatsoever. So if the Virginia plan had been implemented, the three largest states would have controlled not only the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, but could have also overridden all state laws. So as you can guess, this was a non-starter with the smaller states. They took one look at this and said, no, we're not doing that. The small state plan actually advocated the status quo, that we will have representation based on geography. Every state will be represented equally. The small state said we don't care if it's one vote or two votes or 10 votes per state as long as we're represented equally. There isn't a right or a wrong here. Obviously, population was to the benefit of the larger states, which is why in the Virginia plan they advocated population. It worked to the advantage of the smaller states to be represented equally, and therefore they advocated that. So I just want you to know Virginia plan is large state plan, representation based on population. New Jersey plan, small state plan, representation based on geography. And of course, what we ended up with was neither of these, that both sides were given something. The small states were given a chamber that they could dominate. The large states would get a chamber they could dominate. And here's the interesting thing. In order to get anything done, both would have to sign this, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. So that's the Connecticut or the Great Compromise. I really do think, I just call it the Great Compromise. Your book calls it the Connecticut Compromise. It is the same thing. And essentially, if you want to summarize this compromise in one sentence, it's in your note. Instead of representing either states or people, the compromise was we're going to represent them both. So we're going to let the smaller states dominate one chamber. We're going to let the larger states dominate the other chamber. And both of them can check and balance one another, because in order to get a bill passed into law, it's going to have to be passed in identical form. So if you look under 3A, it's underlined. I told you earlier that the U.S. Senate looks a lot like the old Congress under the Articles of Confederation. The U.S. Senate today has representation based on geography. Every state has 2 senators, regardless of size of their population. And so think about what this means. This means that a majority, more than 50% of Americans, are represented by only 18 senators. So here in California, we are the most populated state. We are the most populated state by quite a bit. And yet, we only have 2 senators. And we have approximately, 12, 13% of the nation's population. So population doesn't matter in the Senate. Now, I told you earlier that a minority of Americans live in the other 41 states, which means while a majority of Americans are represented by 18 senators, a minority of Americans are represented by 82 senators. So you can see why this is often called the small state chamber. It's also called the upper house. And the reason it's called the upper house is we stole this from Britain. The thinking in Britain had been that the House of Commons was the lower house and the House of Lords was the upper house, because the upper house was more aristocratic. The lower house was more responsive to the people, and if it was beholden to the people, it was lower. So in our case, the Senate originally was not elected by its citizens. Originally, senators were selected by state legislatures, and therefore the people originally did not elect senators. And so, because the Senate was removed from being directly controlled by the people, its nickname became the upper house. The other chamber under B is the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives would have representation based on population. So every 10 years we have a census. Seats are reapportioned. Everyone begins with one House member. And then in order to get additional representatives, there is a threshold. It is approximately, it's a little bit more than this, but a little over 700,000 people. There are several states that don't even have the threshold for one, but every state is guaranteed one. A good example of this would be Wyoming, which has a little under 600,000 people. They are the least populated state. They have one representative. And notice that California has 53 currently, and I do believe that after the census in 2020, our census number is going to remain 53. We're growing very, very slowly right now, unlike the 1980s when we were growing, I don't know, at 800,000 people a year or something like that. We grew over 8 million people in one decade. And the result was in the 1990 census, California picked up 7 seats. That's not going to happen again. The House of Representatives is often called the lower house or the large state chamber. So you can see that every state has 2 senators, and representation varies dramatically in the House of Representatives. Look at that number, 53 in California and only 1 in Wyoming. I would put several stars next to bicameral equality, not because it's necessarily a test question, I don't believe it is, but because this is what makes the Great Compromise the Great Compromise. What makes the compromise work is that for a bill to become law, it first must be passed in both the House and the Senate in identical form. Not 80% agreement, not 90% agreement, 100% agreement. And what this means is that both chambers have a check and balance over the actions of the other chamber. If the House of Representatives passes a bill that will hurt the small states refuse to pass it in the Senate. If the Senate passes a measure that will hurt the interest of the large states, the House of Representatives refuses to accept it. And so it is only when both chambers agree on the exact wording of a bill and a majority pass that bill, it is only then that it moves to the president's desk for his signature. Now, even though the good news here is that both sides are now protected from the other, both sides are willing to sign off on this agreement because they control their own destiny, so to speak. There was a long-term consequence that I'm not sure they fully appreciated at the time, but we see almost daily today. This check in the Constitution makes lawmaking difficult. Look at that data. You will see it again later. I won't test you on it on the first exam, but you will see it on the final. Since 1945, less than 7% of the bills that have been introduced in Congress have become law. In the last 5 or 6 years, the percentage is under 2%. So we come up with an agreement where the large and the small states cut a deal. They both get protected, but lawmaking is very difficult. Next lecture, Electoral College.